There is a peculiar kind of suffering that comes not from ignorance, but from understanding. Not from being lost in the dark, but from seeing too much light. We speak often of enlightenment as though it were an unambiguous blessing, a final arrival at some paradise of comprehension where all questions dissolve into blissful clarity. But what we rarely discuss, what we seem almost afraid to acknowledge, is that seeing reality as it actually is, rather than as we've been conditioned to believe it should be, carries with it a weight that can feel unbearable. It's the weight of standing alone on a mountaintop while everyone else remains contentedly in the valley below, arguing about which path leads upward, never suspecting that the mountain itself might be an illusion, that up and down are concepts we invented to make sense of a universe that has no preference for either direction. You see, the human mind is not designed for truth. It's designed for survival. Our ancestors who saw the world exactly as it was, who perceived the fundamental emptiness behind all forms, who recognized the fictional nature of the self, who understood viscerally that nothing lasts and nothing matters in the way we pretend it does. These individuals did not pass on their genes with great efficiency. They were too busy staring into the void to run from the predator, too absorbed in the cosmic joke to gather food for winter, too aware of the dreamlike quality of existence to fight for territory or status or mates. No, evolution favored the ones who could believe passionately in illusions, who could commit fully to the game even though the game has no ultimate purpose, who could take seriously the drama of survival and reproduction despite its fundamental absurdity. And so here we are, the descendants of the committed believers, suddenly waking up in the middle of the play and realizing we're actors on a stage, that the lines we're speaking were written by no one in particular, that the audience is just more actors who've forgotten they're performing, and that behind the curtain there's nothing, no director, no playwright, no meaning inscribed in the foundations of reality itself. This realization doesn't come as a gentle dawn. It comes as a rupture, a tearing away of the fabric that held everything together, and what rushes in through that tear is not comfort or peace, but a kind of existential vertigo that never entirely goes away. The Buddha called it dukkha, often translated as suffering, though that word fails to capture the full texture of what he meant. It's more like a pervasive unsatisfactoriness, a fundamental friction between what is and what we wish were true. But the Buddha was pointing at the suffering that comes from ignorance, from clinging to permanence in an impermanent world, from identifying with a self that doesn't exist in the way we think it does. He offered the path to liberation from this suffering through the realization of these truths. What he spoke less about, what perhaps cannot be spoken about to those still caught in the dream, is the suffering that comes after realization itself, the peculiar pain of seeing clearly while being embedded in a world designed for the blind. Imagine for a moment that you've spent your entire life inside a building, never questioning its walls, its ceilings, its floors. The building is your world. You learn its rooms, its corridors, its rules. You make your life within it, and it all makes sense according to its internal logic. Then one day, you discover a door you'd never noticed before. You open it and step through, and suddenly you're outside for the first time. You see the building from the exterior, and you realize it's just one structure among millions, that the sky stretches infinitely above, that the ground extends in all directions, that everything you thought was the totality of existence was actually a tiny, arbitrary container. You can never go back to believing the building is the world. You can never forget what you've seen. But here's the unbearable part. You still have to live in the building. You still have to navigate its rooms, follow its rules, interact with everyone inside who still believes the walls are the edges of reality itself. This is the situation of the person who sees too clearly. They haven't transcended the human condition. They've just become aware of it. And awareness without the power to change what you're aware of is its own special form of torture. You watch people suffer over things that you know are ultimately empty, yet you cannot spare them their suffering, because the suffering is somehow necessary, is part of the very structure of how consciousness unfolds in a biological body embedded in time. You see them building elaborate towers of meaning out of materials that you know will crumble to dust, yet you cannot convince them to stop building, because the building is what gives them the sense of solidity they need to get through the day. You observe them taking sides in arguments about which beautiful falsehood is most true, and you know that no side has any ultimate validity, but choosing not to participate is itself a kind of participation, a statement that is heard as arrogance when it's actually just exhaustion. The mystics throughout history have tried to describe this state, though their descriptions are often dismissed as poetry or metaphor by those who have not experienced it directly. They speak of dark nights of the soul, of the cloud of unknowing, of the desert of the real. They use paradoxical language because ordinary language fails in the face of this experience. They say things like, "I am not," and "God is nothing," and "the way forward is backward," because they're trying to point at something that cannot be captured in concepts. Yet concepts are all we have to communicate with one another, and so their words become scripture, become objects of study, become new walls in new buildings, when what they were trying to do was blow a hole through all walls forever. Alan Watts understood this paradox intimately. He spent his life trying to translate Eastern wisdom for Western audiences, knowing full well that the translation itself was a kind of betrayal, that by putting these insights into words, he was simultaneously revealing and concealing them. He knew that you cannot teach someone to see what he saw. You can only create conditions under which they might spontaneously see it for themselves, and even then, the seeing often brings as much anguish as liberation. He would laugh, that characteristic laugh of his, because he recognized that the whole endeavor was ridiculous from a certain angle, that he was using illusions to point at the dissolution of illusion, using the self to explain that there is no self, using time-bound language to gesture at the timeless. The laughter was not dismissal. It was acknowledgement of the cosmic absurdity of the situation, the divine comedy in which we're all unwitting participants. When you begin to see reality too clearly, the first thing that becomes apparent is that almost everything you've been told is a convenient fiction. Not a malicious lie necessarily, but a useful story that makes the chaos manageable. You were told you are a separate individual, a soul piloting a body, an observer standing apart from what you observe. But when you look closely, really look, with the kind of attention that doesn't blink or shy away, you discover that this boundary between self and other is porous at best, fictional at worst. You are not inside your body looking out at the world through your eyes like a person watching television. You are a pattern that the universe is doing in this particular location, a temporary configuration of energy and matter that has learned to call itself I and to believe in its own continuity, even though every atom in your body is replaced over time, even though your thoughts arise from nowhere and disappear into nowhere, even though what you call your consciousness is more like a constantly changing weather pattern than a stable entity. This realization is supposed to be liberating, and in some sense it is. There's a tremendous freedom in recognizing that you are not the small, vulnerable, isolated ego you took yourself to be. You are the entire field of existence, playing at being this particular character for a while, the way the ocean plays at being a wave. But this freedom comes with a price, and the price is that you can never fully believe in your own story again. You can still live it, you must still live it, because there's nothing else to do. But you live it with a kind of double consciousness, simultaneously in the dream and aware that it's a dream, simultaneously the actor and the audience, and this split awareness creates a unique form of loneliness. The loneliness of clarity is not like ordinary loneliness. Ordinary loneliness is the ache for connection, for someone to see you and understand you and validate your experience. It can be remedied by finding your tribe, your people, your soulmate. But the loneliness that comes from seeing too clearly cannot be remedied by any connection, because the very basis of connection has been revealed as another beautiful fiction. You see others and you love them. Perhaps you love them more deeply than ever before, because you recognize yourself in them. Recognize that their suffering is your suffering, that their joy is your joy, that there is finally no real boundary between you and them. But you also see that they are caught in a trance, that they are suffering from a case of mistaken identity, that they are defending and promoting a self that doesn't exist in the way they think it does, and you cannot wake them from this trance because waking from it is not necessarily a kindness. There's a Zen teaching about the difference between the ordinary person and the enlightened person. The ordinary person is lost in illusion. The enlightened person has seen through illusion, but must still live in the world of illusion. And this second state is actually more difficult than the first. Before you wake up, you have the comfort of not knowing that you're asleep. After you wake up, you have the discomfort of knowing, but you're still subject to the conditions of the dream. You still get hungry and tired. You still experience pain when the body is injured. You still have reactions and preferences and habits that were formed by years of conditioning. The only difference, and it's an enormous difference, is that you see all of this happening rather than being completely identified with it. And this seeing creates a gap, a space between stimulus and response, between thought and action. And in that space, there is both freedom and unbearable awareness. Most wisdom traditions acknowledge this difficulty, though they frame it in different ways. The Buddhists speak of the near enemy of enlightenment, the subtle traps that await even those who have had genuine realization. The Christians talk about the dark night of the soul, that period after the initial mystical awakening when God seems to withdraw and the seeker is left in a desert of meaning. The Sufis describe stages of the path where the intoxication of divine union gives way to sobriety, and sobriety is much harder to bear than intoxication because you're simultaneously aware of the ultimate reality and the relative reality, and you must somehow live in both at once. These traditions developed over centuries of observation, watching what happened to people who had profound insights into the nature of reality. And what they observed was that the insights often brought not an end to suffering, but a transformation of suffering into a different key. You begin to notice things that others don't notice, and these things are not always pleasant. You notice how much of human behavior is driven by fear and the denial of death. You notice how people are constantly telling themselves stories about who they are and why they matter, and how these stories must be defended at all costs, because without them, there's just this raw, naked existence with no inherent meaning or direction. You notice how much energy goes into maintaining the illusion of control, the pretense that we are the authors of our lives rather than characters in a story that's writing itself. You notice how language shapes thought, how the structure of our sentences creates the illusion of a separate actor performing actions, when really there is just action happening, just this eternal now expressing itself in an infinite variety of forms. And once you notice these things, you cannot unnotice them. You're like someone who's learned to see the code in the matrix. You still see the illusion, but you also see through it simultaneously, and this double vision becomes exhausting. You watch people anxiously planning their futures, and you know that the future is a mental construct, that there is only ever this moment, that their plans are just thoughts arising in the present about an imaginary timeline. But you also know that telling them this is useless, because the planning serves a function, gives them a sense of agency and purpose, and destroying that without having something equally functional to replace it with is cruel. So you remain silent, or you speak in careful ways that might plant seeds of doubt without totally demolishing their framework. And this carefulness, this constant calibration of how much truth to tell, becomes another burden. The burden is compounded by the fact that clarity itself is unstable. You don't reach some permanent state of seeing and remain there forever. Consciousness fluctuates. You have moments of perfect understanding where everything is transparent and obvious and luminous, where you can see the divine play in every gesture and every breath, where separation is clearly an illusion and unity is the only reality. And then you have moments, sometimes hours or days or weeks, where you're back in the trance, identified with the character, suffering over trivial nonsense, completely forgetting what you saw so clearly just a short time ago. This oscillation is maddening because you know what's possible. You've tasted that freedom, but you cannot command it to appear, cannot make yourself see clearly through force of will. The clarity comes when it comes, and when it goes, you're left with the memory of it, which is almost worse than never having experienced it at all. There's a story about a Zen student who had a profound awakening experience. He saw directly into the empty nature of all things, experienced the dissolution of self and other, felt the boundaries of his being expand to include the entire universe. It lasted for perhaps 20 minutes, and then it faded, and he was left with just the ordinary consciousness again, the sense of being a separate person with problems and desires. He went to his teacher in great distress and said, "I had this amazing experience, but now it's gone. How do I get it back?" And the teacher said, "You want to get back something you never left. You want to experience again something that is always already the case. This wanting is what obscures what you're looking for." The student understood intellectually what the teacher was saying, but he could not stop the wanting, could not stop the comparison between the clarity he had briefly experienced and the cloudiness of his ordinary state. And this comparison became a new form of suffering, perhaps more subtle and more intractable than anything he'd experienced before. This is what happens when you see reality too clearly. You develop a nostalgia for clarity itself, a craving for the state of seeing, and this craving becomes the very obstacle to seeing. You want enlightenment, and the wanting is ignorance. You want to be free from suffering, and the desire for freedom is a form of suffering. You want to help others wake up, and this messianic impulse is your ego finding a new way to assert itself. Every insight becomes a potential trap. Every realization becomes something the mind can grasp and turn into a new identity, a new story about who you are. You become someone who sees clearly, and this identity is just as much an illusion as any other, just as much an obstacle to simple being. And yet you cannot unknow what you know. You cannot return to innocence. You've eaten from the tree of knowledge, and you've been expelled from the garden of comfortable ignorance. You're stuck in this intermediary state, too aware to be fully asleep, too embodied to be fully awake. You're the walking wounded of spiritual realization, carrying around an injury that is invisible to everyone else, an injury that in some strange way is also a gift, though the gift feels more like a curse most of the time. Alan Watts spoke about this using the metaphor of the game. Life is a game, he said, but it's a game that only works if you forget you're playing it. Once you become conscious that it's a game, you're in a very peculiar position. You can't really play anymore with the same innocence and intensity, but you're still on the field, still subject to the rules, still involved in the action. You can play consciously, with a kind of ironic detachment, understanding that the stakes are both infinitely important and utterly meaningless, depending on which level of reality you're viewing them from. But this conscious play requires a kind of split attention that is deeply tiring. You have to be in the game and outside it simultaneously, and maintaining this double perspective demands a constant vigilance, a continuous remembering that most people never have to engage in because they're just playing, completely absorbed in the drama, and that absorption is actually the easier way to live. The person who sees too clearly often finds themselves playing the role of the witness, watching the human drama unfold with a mixture of compassion and helplessness. They see someone suffering and they recognize that the suffering is based on a misunderstanding, on an identification with thoughts and feelings that are transient, on a belief in separation that is ultimately illusory. But they also see that this person needs to go through whatever they're going through, that the suffering is not a mistake, but part of how consciousness explores itself, part of how the universe comes to know itself through the experience of limitation and pain. So what do? Do you intervene, try to alleviate the suffering, even though you know the alleviation might prevent some necessary learning? Do you remain detached, honoring the other person's path, even though your detachment might look like callousness? Do you speak the truth as you see it, even though your truth might be devastating to someone who isn't ready to hear it? These questions have no comfortable answers, and the person who sees clearly is constantly navigating this ethical minefield, constantly wondering whether their action or inaction is helpful or harmful, constantly doubting their own judgment because they've seen through the illusion of there being a self who could make right or wrong judgments in the first place. It's a paralyzing awareness, and many who have it deal with it by retreating from the world, becoming hermits or monks, removing themselves from situations where they might cause harm through their inability to fully participate in the collective trance. Others go the opposite direction, becoming teachers or therapists or artists, trying to use their clarity in service of others, even though they know that true seeing cannot be transmitted, only catalyzed, and the catalysis is often painful. There's something important to understand here about the relationship between clarity and compassion. You might think that seeing reality more clearly would make you less compassionate, more cold, more detached from the concerns of ordinary humans who are still caught in their dramas. And in some cases, this is exactly what happens. The person mistakes clarity for superiority, mistakes seeing through illusions for being beyond illusions, and develops a spiritual arrogance that is deeply unattractive and ultimately another form of delusion. But genuine clarity tends to produce the opposite effect. When you really see that there is no fundamental boundary between yourself and others, when you recognize that their suffering is quite literally your suffering, because there is only one consciousness expressing itself through many apparent forms, you become more compassionate, not less. You see that everyone is doing the best they can with the level of awareness they have, that cruelty comes from pain and ignorance rather than from some essential evil, that even the most terrible actions are rooted in a misunderstanding about the nature of self and reality. This compassion, however, is not sentimental. It doesn't mean you think everyone should be comfortable or that suffering should always be prevented. It's more like the compassion a parent has for a child who is learning to walk and keeps falling down. The parent doesn't rush in to prevent every fall because the falling is how the child learns. But the parent is present, attentive, ready to help if the injury becomes too severe, and the parent feels the child's pain without being overwhelmed by it. This is the kind of compassion that comes from clarity, a spacious, allowing compassion that can hold suffering without needing to immediately fix it, that can witness pain without collapsing into it, that can see the bigger picture while still honoring the reality of the present moment's difficulties. But this compassion is also exhausting to maintain, because you're constantly holding these multiple perspectives at once. You're seeing the person in front of you as they see themselves, as a separate individual with real problems that need solving. You're also seeing them as they truly are, as a temporary manifestation of the infinite, playing a role in the cosmic drama, ultimately indestructible, because what they really are was never born and can never die. And you're holding both of these perspectives simultaneously, speaking to the person they think they are while remaining aware of what they really are. And this requires a kind of flexibility of mind that is not natural, that must be cultivated and maintained through constant practice. The ancient Greeks had a word, metaxy, which means the in-between, the realm of existence that is neither fully mortal nor fully divine, but somewhere in the middle. Humans exist in this metaxy, this intermediary zone, and the person who sees clearly becomes acutely aware of this in-betweenness. They are not gods, not free from the conditions of embodied existence, not exempt from pain and confusion and death. But they are also not merely animals, not purely driven by instinct and conditioning, not completely identified with their physical forms. They are caught between these two modes of being, and this caughtness is uncomfortable. There's a longing for resolution, for coming down definitively on one side or the other, for being either fully enlightened and beyond all suffering, or fully immersed in the dream and blissfully unaware of the larger context. But the metaxy is where most awakening human beings actually live, and learning to be at peace in this liminal space is perhaps the real spiritual work. Watts often compared the spiritual journey to a joke, and like all good jokes, the punchline is that there is no punchline, or rather, the punchline is the setup, and the setup is the punchline, and the person who gets the joke realizes they were the joke all along. You set out seeking enlightenment, seeking to transcend your limited self, seeking to find the ultimate truth, and after years or decades of seeking, you realize that there was never anyone seeking, that the seeker and the sought were always the same thing, that you are what you were looking for, and the entire journey was an elaborate detour that brings you right back to where you started, except now you see it with different eyes. This is hilarious and tragic at the same time, and the ability to laugh at this cosmic prank is a sign that you've understood something essential about the nature of existence. But the laughter is tinged with sadness, because you look around and see that almost everyone is still on the journey, still seeking, still believing that there's somewhere to get to, something to achieve, someone to become. And you remember when you believed that too. Remember how earnest and motivated you were, how certain that if you just meditated enough, or read enough books, or found the right teacher, or did the right practices, you would finally arrive at the destination. And you want to tell them that there is no destination, that the pathlessness is the path, that what they're seeking is already the case and cannot be achieved because it cannot be lost. But you also know that telling them this is pointless, that they need to exhaust themselves with seeking before they can give up seeking, that the very exhaustion of the search is what creates the conditions for the realization that there was never anything to search for. So you're caught in this position of knowing something that cannot be shared through ordinary means, of having seen something that can only be seen by each person for themselves, and this creates a kind of isolation that is very hard to describe. You can be surrounded by people, in intimate relationships, doing meaningful work in the world, and still feel fundamentally alone because you're aware of something that most people are not aware of, and this awareness creates an unbridgeable gap. Not a gap of superiority. You're not better than anyone else, not more advanced or more worthy or more evolved. Just aware of something they're not yet aware of, the way someone who's been to Paris is aware of something that someone who's never left their hometown is not aware of. It's not better or worse, just different, but the difference makes complete mutual understanding impossible. And here's where the pain really sets in. You start to question whether the seeing was worth it. You have moments, maybe many moments, where you wish you could go back to sleep, could return to the comfortable ignorance of believing your thoughts are true, believing yourself is real, believing that the drama of your life is ultimately significant. You watch people who are still asleep, who still believe wholeheartedly in their stories, and you envy them their certainty, their passion, their ability to care deeply about things that you now see as fundamentally empty. They can lose themselves in their careers, their relationships, their causes, their creations, and you remember what that felt like, that beautiful absorption in the game, and you realize you've lost something precious, even as you've gained something profound. This is the rarely acknowledged cost of awakening. You lose the ability to be completely here in the way that a person who's fully identified with their character can be here. You're always somewhat elsewhere, watching from a distance, aware of the larger context, unable to fully commit to the role you're playing because you know it's a role. And this creates a pallor over experience, a kind of translucence where everything feels slightly less solid, slightly less important, slightly less real. Colors might seem less vivid. Emotions might seem less gripping. The stakes of everything seem lower because you know that on the ultimate level, nothing can truly be won or lost, since there's no one to win or lose anything. This flattening of experience is not what the wisdom traditions usually emphasize when they talk about enlightenment. They talk about bliss and peace and freedom, and these are certainly aspects of the realization. But they don't talk as much about the grayness that can set in, the subtle depression that comes from seeing through the illusions that make life feel meaningful to most people. They don't talk about the difficulty of motivation when you understand that there's nowhere to go and nothing to achieve. They don't talk about the challenge of maintaining relationships when you see that the person you're relating to is just another appearance in consciousness, just another wave in the same ocean that you are. The mystics who have written about this stage often describe it as a kind of purgatory, a state where you're no longer in hell but not yet in heaven, suspended between the worlds, belonging fully to neither. And the teaching is usually that you must pass through this purgatory, must endure this dark night, must maintain your practice and your faith, even when everything seems meaningless and empty. They say that on the other side of this dark night is a second awakening, a reawakening to the ordinary world, but now with full participation, full engagement, the ability to play the game wholeheartedly while still knowing it's a game. They describe sages who are completely spontaneous and natural, who laugh and cry and love and work without the slightest trace of self-consciousness, who have somehow integrated the absolute and relative perspectives into a seamless whole. But what they don't often mention is that reaching this integration can take a very long time, if it happens at all in a given lifetime. Many people who have profound realizations spend years or even decades in this intermediary state, this metaxy, where they're caught between seeing and being, between knowing and doing, between the absolute truth and the relative reality. And during this time, they suffer in ways that are invisible to others, in ways they often cannot articulate even to themselves, because the suffering is not about anything in particular, not something that can be fixed by changing external circumstances. It's an existential suffering, a metaphysical loneliness, a homesickness for a home that doesn't exist in space or time. Alan Watts himself lived much of his life in this tension. He could speak brilliantly about non-duality, could evoke the direct experience of awakening through his words and his voice, could help thousands of people glimpse the truth of what they really are. But his personal life was often chaotic and painful. He struggled with alcoholism, with failed marriages, with the gap between what he knew intellectually and what he could embody consistently. And rather than seeing this as a failure or a hypocrisy, it might be more accurate to see it as the natural consequence of seeing clearly while still being fully human, of having accessed the transcendent perspective while still being subject to the immanent conditions of body and mind and culture. This is important to understand because there's a tendency in spiritual communities to judge people based on how well their lives match up to some idealized notion of what an enlightened person should be like. We expect enlightened people to be perfectly serene, always compassionate, free from all neuroses and bad habits, living examples of impeccable virtue. And when they turn out to be just as messy and complicated as everyone else, perhaps even more so because they're aware of the messiness in a way that others are not, we feel betrayed or disillusioned. But this expectation is based on a misunderstanding of what awakening is. Awakening is not the perfection of the person. It's the realization that there is no person to perfect. And this realization does not magically eliminate the conditioning and habits and tendencies that have been built up over a lifetime of being this particular body-mind organism. What it does do is create some space around those habits, some room for them to be seen and potentially shifted. But the seeing alone doesn't automatically shift anything. You might see very clearly that your habit of drinking too much is causing problems, but the seeing doesn't necessarily give you the power to stop, because the drinking is serving some function, numbing some pain, filling some void, and until that underlying need is addressed, the behavior tends to continue even in the face of clear awareness. This is humbling and frustrating for people who have profound spiritual insights, because they expect the insights to translate directly into improved behavior, and when they don't, there's a sense of failure, a feeling that maybe the insights weren't as real as they seemed, or maybe they're not as awakened as they thought, or maybe the whole spiritual path is just another ego game. But perhaps the truth is simpler and more paradoxical. The insights are real, and the person is still a mess, and both of these things can be true simultaneously because they're talking about different levels of reality. On the ultimate level, everything is perfect exactly as it is, and there's no one to be improved or purified or perfected. On the relative level, this particular body-mind organism has issues and problems and dysfunctions that cause suffering to itself and others, and these can and perhaps should be worked with. The person who sees clearly is aware of both levels, and this awareness doesn't resolve the contradictions, it just makes them more apparent, more impossible to ignore. So you have people who can speak eloquently about the illusion of the separate self, and then turn around and defend their ego in petty arguments. You have people who understand intellectually that attachment causes suffering, and yet remain desperately attached to their ideas, their images, their identities as spiritual teachers. You have people who preach love and unity, and then act in ways that are divisive and judgmental. And before we dismiss these people as frauds or hypocrites, we might consider that they're simply demonstrating what it's actually like to be a human who has seen through the human illusion while still being caught in the human condition. They're showing us the messy reality of awakening, which is very different from the clean, conceptual version we read about in books. This messiness extends to the question of teaching and sharing insights with others. Many people who have profound realizations feel called to teach, to help others see what they've seen, to alleviate the suffering they see all around them. But teaching spiritual truth is a minefield of potential delusions and pitfalls. First, there's the problem that you cannot give someone else your realization. You can point, you can create conditions, you can share practices and perspectives, but the actual seeing has to happen directly in the other person, and there's no way to make it happen. Second, there's the danger of the teaching becoming just more content for the mind, more concepts to believe in or argue about, rather than a catalyst for direct experience. Third, there's the risk of the teacher's ego getting inflated by the role, by having followers and influence, by being seen as special or enlightened, and this inflation obscures the very insight the teacher is trying to share. Alan Watts was acutely aware of these dangers. He often said he was not a guru, not a spiritual teacher in the traditional sense, but more of an entertainer, a philosopher, someone who enjoyed thinking and talking about these things, but didn't claim to have achieved some permanent state of enlightenment that qualified him to be anyone's master. This was both honest and self-protective, a way of maintaining some boundaries against the projections that people inevitably place on anyone who speaks about spiritual topics with authority and charisma. But it also created confusion, because people naturally wanted to learn from him, wanted him to be their teacher, and his refusal to fully embrace that role left a kind of vacuum where clarity might have been. This ambivalence about teaching is common among Western people who have Eastern spiritual insights, because we don't have the traditional structures and frameworks that Eastern cultures developed over millennia for handling the transmission of wisdom. In a traditional Zen monastery or Hindu ashram, there are clear roles, protocols, practices, hierarchies that have been refined over centuries to maximize the chances of genuine transmission while minimizing the risks of inflation and delusion. In the West, we're mostly making it up as we go along, borrowing bits and pieces from different traditions, trying to adapt ancient wisdom to modern contexts, and the results are often chaotic and problematic. We get self-proclaimed gurus who are narcissists or sexual predators. We get spiritual communities that function more like cults than genuine paths to liberation. We get the commodification of enlightenment, with expensive retreats and workshops that promise transformation, but deliver mostly just new concepts and temporary experiences. And yet, despite all these problems, the insights themselves remain valid and necessary. The fact that teaching is difficult and often corrupted doesn't mean that people shouldn't try to share what they've seen. The fact that spiritual communities often go wrong doesn't mean that people shouldn't seek to support each other in awakening. The fact that enlightenment is often misunderstood and misrepresented doesn't mean that liberation from suffering is not possible or not worth pursuing. It just means that we have to be more sophisticated, more critical, more humble in how we approach these matters. We have to be willing to question every teacher, every teaching, every tradition, while also remaining open to genuine wisdom wherever it appears. We have to hold our insights lightly, knowing that as soon as we grasp them too tightly, they become obstacles rather than aids. The person who sees reality too clearly lives with this constant tension between speaking and staying silent, between engagement and withdrawal, between honoring the truth of emptiness and honoring the truth of the relative world where actions have consequences and suffering is real. There's no formula for navigating this tension. You simply have to feel your way through each situation, making decisions from a place of uncertainty, never entirely sure if you're helping or hindering, if you're saying too much or too little, if you're being compassionate or just enabling delusion. And you have to be okay with making mistakes, with getting it wrong, with sometimes causing harm even when you intended to help, because perfection is another illusion, and the attempt to never cause any harm can itself be harmful when it leads to complete paralysis and withdrawal. What helps, somewhat, is recognizing that this tension is not a problem to be solved, but a paradox to be lived. The word paradox comes from Greek roots meaning beyond belief, or contrary to opinion, and paradox is the native language of awakened consciousness. Every statement about reality, when seen clearly, contains its opposite. You are the universe, and you are this tiny speck in an incomprehensibly vast cosmos. You are nothing, and you are everything. You have complete freedom, and you have no choice. The self doesn't exist, and yet something is reading these words right now. Death is the end of everything, and nothing can ever die because energy is never created or destroyed, only transformed. Time is an illusion, and yet your body is aging, moving inexorably toward its dissolution. The rational mind rebels against paradox. It wants consistency, wants to resolve contradictions into neat formulations that can be defended and explained. But the reality that clear seeing reveals is irreducibly paradoxical, and learning to rest in paradox without the compulsion to resolve, it is a sign of maturity in spiritual understanding. You stop asking which perspective is the right one, the absolute or the relative, the timeless or the temporal, the unified or the multiplicity, and you start recognizing that all perspectives are partial, that reality is too vast and complex to be captured by any single viewpoint, that truth is prismatic rather than monolithic. This recognition brings a certain flexibility to how you move through the world. You can speak in absolute terms when that's what's called for, pointing to the unchanging awareness that underlies all experience. You can speak in relative terms when that's appropriate, acknowledging the reality of cause and effect, the importance of ethics and compassion, the need to address suffering where you find it. You can switch between these registers fluidly, without feeling like you're contradicting yourself, because you understand that they're complementary rather than conflicting. It's like being fluent in multiple languages and knowing which one to speak, depending on who you're talking to and what you're trying to communicate. But this flexibility can also make you feel fragmented, like you're constantly shifting masks, never quite settled into a single consistent identity. And in a way, that's exactly what's happening. The unified self that most people believe they are has been revealed as a fiction, as a narrative convenience, rather than a metaphysical fact. What's left is a kind of fluid responsiveness, a capacity to be different things in different contexts, and this can feel liberating or unsettling depending on the moment. Sometimes it feels like a kind of freedom, the ability to not be trapped in a single identity, to respond freshly to each situation without the burden of maintaining a consistent self-image. Other times it feels like a loss of integrity, a failure to stand for anything, a wishy-washy relativism that avoids commitment. The truth, as always, is more nuanced. Having seen through the illusion of a fixed self doesn't mean you become a shapeshifter with no consistent characteristics. The body-mind organism still has its particular patterns, preferences, tendencies, limitations. You still have what might be called a personality, even if you know that this personality is more like a habit than an essence. The difference is that you're not as identified with it, not as defensive of it, more able to see it as just one possibility among infinite others. And this perspective allows for change and growth in ways that weren't possible when you were rigidly attached to being a particular kind of person. But it also means you sometimes don't know who you are or how to be. You lose the security of having a fixed identity to refer back to, a stable sense of, this is who I am and what I stand for. Instead, there's just this openness, this not knowing, and you have to make choices without the reassurance of having a solid self to make those choices from. Some days this feels like dancing, other days it feels like drowning, and you learn to ride these fluctuations without getting too attached to either state, recognizing that the dancing and the drowning are both just experiences arising in awareness, neither more real or more true than the other. Alan Watts used the metaphor of life as music to point to this quality of existence. Music unfolds in time, but the point of music is not to reach the end of the song. The point is the song itself, the flowing sound, the pattern of tension and resolution that creates beauty without needing to go anywhere or accomplish anything. Life is like this. It's not a journey from one place to another, not a problem to be solved, not a task to be completed. It's a dance, a play, a spontaneous improvisation, and the joy is in the dancing itself, not in arriving at some final destination. When you see this clearly, you stop treating your life as a means to an end and start experiencing it as an end in itself, as something valuable simply because it's happening, without needing any further justification or purpose. But here's the difficult part. Even though you understand this intellectually, even though you've had experiences where you felt it directly, you can't sustain that perspective continuously. You slip back into goal-oriented thinking, into treating the present moment as merely a stepping stone to some better future moment. You get caught up in striving and achieving and becoming, forgetting that there's nowhere to get to, that this is already it, that the kingdom of heaven is always at hand if you have eyes to see it. And then you notice that you've forgotten, and there's a moment of remembering, a moment of seeing clearly again, and then that fades too, and the cycle continues endlessly. This is what it means to be awakened but not enlightened, to have seen the truth but not embody it fully, to know the way but still stumble on the path. The question arises, is there a state beyond this fluctuation, a permanent establishment in clear seeing that doesn't come and go? The traditional teachings say yes, that there are stages of realization where the insights become so thoroughly integrated that you never lose sight of the truth, never fall back into complete identification with the ego. But these teachings come from cultures and contexts very different from ours, and it's not clear whether the same trajectory is possible for people living in modern Western society with all its distractions and demands and complexities. Maybe the best we can hope for is this oscillation between clarity and confusion, with the clarity becoming more frequent and more stable over time, but never completely fixed or permanent. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the expectation of permanent enlightenment is itself another trap, another way the ego tries to establish itself as something special and superior. Maybe the willingness to be uncertain, to not know, to live with the ambiguity and the fluctuation, is actually a deeper form of wisdom than any fixed state of realization could be. Maybe the person who claims to be permanently enlightened is just someone who's gotten very good at maintaining a particular self-image, while the person who admits to ongoing struggle and doubt is closer to the truth of what it actually means to be a conscious being in an impermanent world. There's a story from the Zen tradition about a monk who spent 20 years in intensive practice, meditating for hours every day, studying with various masters, having profound experiences of emptiness and non-duality. Finally, he felt he had achieved complete enlightenment. He went to his teacher and said, "I have realized that the self is an illusion, that all phenomena are empty of inherent existence, that there is only the pure consciousness witnessing everything without attachment. I am free." The teacher looked at him and said, "That's nice. Now go clean the toilets." The monk was offended, thinking the teacher hadn't understood the profundity of his realization. But as he was cleaning the toilets, angry and resentful, he suddenly understood what the teacher was pointing to. That realization means nothing if it doesn't translate into a willingness to engage fully with the most mundane and unglamorous aspects of existence. That true freedom is not about transcending the world, but about being able to meet every situation, even cleaning toilets, with complete presence and equanimity. This teaching is pointing at the integration of absolute and relative, of transcendence and immanence, of seeing through everything while still fully participating in the human experience. It's saying that the test of realization is not in the peak experiences or the profound insights, but in how you handle the ordinary moments, the frustrations, the mundane tasks, the people who annoy you. Can you clean the toilet with the same presence and awareness that you bring to meditation? Can you pay your taxes with the same sense of cosmic humor that you feel when contemplating the void? Can you love your difficult family member with the same unconditional acceptance that you extend to the universe as a whole? If not, then maybe what you've realized is still just a concept, still just an idea about enlightenment, rather than the embodied reality of it. This is where the rubber meets the road in terms of seeing reality clearly. It's relatively easy to have insights during meditation, or psychedelic experiences, or mystical moments in nature. It's much harder to maintain clarity while stuck in traffic, or dealing with a difficult boss, or facing a serious health diagnosis, or navigating the ending of an important relationship. These ordinary and challenging situations are where your realization is tested, And most people who have had profound insights discover that their insights don't hold up very well under pressure. The clarity evaporates, and you're back to being angry, afraid, defensive, grasping, all the habitual reactions that you thought you'd transcended. This can be deeply disappointing. You thought you'd crossed some threshold, graduated to a new level of consciousness, achieved something permanent and unshakable. But you discover that consciousness is not like that awareness has no achievements, that there is no permanent state to arrive at, because states by definition are temporary. What's permanent is that which witnesses all states, and that witness is always already here, always already free, regardless of what's happening in the content of experience. But recognizing this intellectually and embodying it consistently are two very different things, and the gap between them can feel like an unbridgeable chasm. The person who sees too clearly is acutely aware of this gap, and the awareness itself becomes another form of suffering. You know what's possible. You've experienced moments of complete presence, complete acceptance, complete freedom from identification. But you can't make those moments happen through effort, and in the absence of those moments, you're left with the ordinary consciousness that still clings and judges and resists and craves. You're caught in the middle, neither fully deluded nor fully free, and this middle ground is uncomfortable because it lacks the certainty of either extreme. If you were completely deluded, you wouldn't know any better, and you could live your life without this constant self-observation and self-doubt. If you were completely free, you'd be at peace with whatever arises. But in the middle, you're aware enough to see your own patterns and limitations, but not free enough to be completely unaffected by them. Alan Watts sometimes spoke about the figure of the holy fool or the crazy wisdom teacher, the person who has gone beyond conventional morality and social norms because they've seen through the arbitrary nature of all human constructs. These figures appear in many traditions: the Zen lunatic, the Sufi drunk, the Christian fool for Christ, and they represent a kind of freedom that is both attractive and troubling. They're attractive because they seem to have broken out of the cage that confines most of us, because they're living spontaneously from some place beyond conditioning and fear. But they're troubling because their behavior can be genuinely destructive or harmful, and there's often a fine line between genuine crazy wisdom and just plain craziness, between transcending conventions and simply being irresponsible or unethical. The danger is that people who have genuine insights can use those insights to justify their shadows and pathologies, can claim that they're beyond good and evil, when really they're just acting out their unconscious patterns with spiritual rhetoric as cover. I'm not being cruel. I'm teaching you detachment. I'm not being selfish. I'm manifesting my true nature. I'm not avoiding responsibility. I'm living in the now. These kinds of spiritual bypassing are common among people who have had profound experiences but haven't done the difficult work of integrating those experiences with ethical maturity and psychological health. True clarity includes seeing your own shadow, your own delusions, your own capacity for self-deception. It means being ruthlessly honest with yourself about your motivations, your blind spots, your ongoing conditioning. And this honesty is painful because it means you can't hide behind your spiritual insights, can't use your realizations as a shield against having to face your own messiness and imperfection. You have to admit that yes, you've seen through the illusion of self, and yes, you're still petty and jealous sometimes. Yes, you understand that attachment causes suffering, and yes, you're still attached to all sorts of things. Yes, you know that everything is empty, and yes, you still suffer when things don't go your way. This simultaneity, seeing clearly and still being caught, understanding and still being conditioned, being free and still being bound, is the lived reality of most people who have profound spiritual insights. And the teaching that's embedded in this reality is that awakening is not about reaching some final state where you're beyond all human limitations. It's about recognizing what you truly are, which is not the limited human, but also not separate from the limited human. You are the space in which the human drama unfolds, the awareness that witnesses joy and suffering without being diminished or enhanced by either. And this recognition doesn't eliminate the drama. It just changes your relationship to it, creates some breathing room around it, allows it to be what it is without the compulsive need to change it or escape from it. But living from this recognition is not easy, and anyone who tells you it's easy is either lying or hasn't really understood what they're talking about. It requires a constant vigilance, a constant returning to presence, a constant letting go of the identification that keeps reasserting itself. It's like trying to swim upstream against the current of millions of years of evolutionary conditioning that wants you to take everything personally, to defend your territory, to secure your survival, to pass on your genes. These biological imperatives don't just disappear because you've had a spiritual insight. They continue operating, and you have to work with them, not against them, finding ways to honor the body's wisdom while not being enslaved by the body's drives. This is where spiritual practice becomes essential, not as a means to achieve enlightenment, but as a way of maintaining some connection to clarity in the midst of all the forces that pull you back into identification and delusion. Meditation, contemplation, time in nature, creative expression, deep conversation with others who see. These are not ways to get somewhere, but ways to remember what's always already the case. Ways to create little gaps in the constant mental chatter where something deeper can be heard. And the practice has to be ongoing, has to be renewed daily, or even moment by moment, because the pull back into the trance is constant and powerful. Alan Watts was ambivalent about spiritual practice in some ways. He recognized that practice can become just another form of striving, another way the ego tries to improve itself and achieve something. He pointed out the paradox that you're trying to practice being what you already are, which is absurd when you think about it. It's like practicing seeing when you already have eyes, or practicing breathing when you're already breathing. The practice is both necessary and ridiculous, and you have to hold both of those truths simultaneously. You practice because it helps, because it creates conditions favorable to realization, because it's what you do when you don't know what else to do. But you also recognize that the practice is not really getting you anywhere, that there's nowhere to get to, that what you're seeking is already here and has always been here and could never not be here. This paradoxical relationship to practice is emblematic of the whole predicament of seeing clearly. Everything is a paradox. You try, but you also let go of trying. You care deeply, but you're also completely detached. You're engaged with life, but you see it as a dream. You love people, but you know they're not who they think they are. You work to reduce suffering, but you see that suffering is somehow perfect in the grand scheme of things. You speak truth, but you know that truth cannot be captured in words. You live, but you see that there's no one living, just life happening, just this eternal now expressing itself in infinite variations. The person who sees too clearly lives in this paradox constantly, and it's disorienting and exhausting. There's no solid ground to stand on, no fixed reference point, no certainty about anything. And yet, paradoxically, there's a kind of peace in this groundlessness once you stop fighting it. When you give up the need to know, the need to be certain, the need to have everything figured out and settled, there's a relaxation that becomes possible. You stop trying to resolve the paradoxes, and you simply live them, you inhabit them, you become them. And in that inhabiting, something shifts. The suffering doesn't disappear completely, but it loses some of its grip. You suffer, but you're not as identified with the suffering. You hurt, but you're also vast enough to hold the hurt without being overwhelmed by it. This is what mature spirituality looks like. Not the transcendence of the human condition, but the full acceptance of it, the willingness to be completely human, while knowing that your humanity is just a temporary costume that awareness is wearing for a while. You get to be both the actor and the role, both the dreamer and the dream, both the witness and the witnessed. And you learn to dance between these perspectives with some grace, with some humor, with some humility about the fact that you don't have it all figured out and you never will, because the mystery is too deep, too vast, too infinite to ever be fully comprehended by a finite mind. And maybe this is the final teaching for those who see reality too clearly, that the clarity itself is not the goal, that seeing through everything is not the end point, that understanding the cosmic joke is not the same as transcending suffering. The goal, if there is one, is to be able to live fully as a human being while being aware of the larger context, to play the game with complete commitment while knowing it's a game, to love with your whole heart while knowing that love is another beautiful appearance in consciousness, to create and work and relate and feel without losing sight of the emptiness that underlies all form. This is incredibly difficult, perhaps impossible to sustain continuously. But it's possible in moments, and the moments accumulate, and gradually you develop a kind of fluency in moving between the absolute and relative perspectives, between form and emptiness, between engagement and detachment. You become, in a sense, bilingual, able to speak the language of the world and the language of the void, and to translate between them when necessary. And this bilingualism, this ability to inhabit multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously, is perhaps what wisdom actually is. The pain of seeing clearly never completely goes away. There's always a loneliness in being awake in a world of dreamers, always a melancholy in recognizing the transience of everything you love, always a frustration in seeing solutions to suffering that most people are not ready to hear. But alongside the pain, there's also a beauty that becomes visible to those who see clearly, the beauty of existence itself, just as it is, without any need for it to be different or better or more meaningful than it is. There's the beauty of a moment of genuine connection, even if you know the connection is between two illusions. There's the beauty of a tree, or a piece of music, or a kind gesture, even if you know that beauty is just another interpretation your nervous system is adding to raw sensory data. There's the beauty of being alive, of being consciousness having an experience, even if you know that consciousness is all there is, and having an experience is redundant, because consciousness is experience. Alan Watts spent his life trying to communicate this beauty, this tragic comic reality of being human and aware. He tried to make the insights of Eastern philosophy accessible to Western minds, knowing that the translation would always be imperfect, that something essential would always be lost in the attempt to put it into words. But he also knew that words were all we have, that pointing is better than not pointing, even if the pointing can never directly convey what it's pointing at. He spoke and wrote and recorded because that's what he was moved to do, because silence seemed like a betrayal, even though silence might be more truthful, because helping even one person wake up seemed worth all the inevitable misunderstandings and distortions that would come from teaching. And in the end, maybe that's all any of us can do. Those of us who have seen too much, who carry this burden of clarity that is also a gift. We can share what we've seen, knowing that our sharing will be imperfect. We can create little openings, little invitations, little reminders for others who are ready to question the dream. We can live our lives as best we can, with as much presence and compassion and humor as we can muster, making peace with our own contradictions and hypocrisies and failures. We can stop pretending we have it all figured out and simply be honest about the mystery of it all, the strange glory and terror of being conscious in an unconscious universe, or perhaps of being the universe becoming conscious of itself, looking at itself with amazement and confusion, asking, "What am I?" and finding that the question and the questioner are somehow the same thing. The silent pain of seeing reality too clearly is the price of admission to this deeper dimension of existence. It's not a price everyone chooses to pay, and that's fine. There's no obligation to wake up, no moral imperative to see through the illusions that make life manageable and meaningful for most people. But for those who do wake up, whether through intention or accident, the path forward is not about going back to sleep or achieving some final transcendence. It's about learning to live in the in-between, in the metaxy, in the paradox, with patience and kindness toward yourself and others, knowing that we're all just stumbling through this cosmic mystery together, some with eyes open and some with eyes closed, but all equally loved by the universe that dreams us into being, moment by moment, breath by breath, until this particular dream comes to an end and something else begins, or nothing begins, and it was all just a brief, beautiful, impossible dance of light and shadow, meaning and emptiness, suffering and joy, held together by nothing but the awareness that witnesses it all and is somehow, impossibly, what you truly are and always have been, even though you never were and never will be, because there is no you and there never was. And yet here you are, reading these words, being this moment of consciousness, this fleeting configuration of the infinite, wearing the costume of humanity for just a little while longer before the costume dissolves, and what remains is what was always already the case. This vast, empty, luminous awareness that has no name, no form, no story, and is somehow the only thing that ever really was.